July 18, 1943. The Sicilian sun beat down with merciless intensity as Operation Husky entered its 9th day. Along the dusty approach to Agrigento, a convoy of American half-tracks crawled forward, their metal skin radiating heat like the inside of a baker's oven. Staff Sergeant Michael Donovan wiped the sweat from his brow, his fingers coming away coated with a paste of dust, salt, and sunscreen. His eyes never left the horizon, where the ancient Greek temples stood in silent witness to yet another army marching beneath their weathered columns. The war had come to Sicily, transforming its breathtaking beauty into a lethal battleground where antiquity and modern warfare collided in violent contradiction. Donovan's hands rested on the grips of his mounted Browning M2 50 caliber machine gun, a weapon that had already saved his life twice since landing on the beaches 9 days earlier. The men in his squad called it the voice of God for the distinctive thunder it produced when firing, a sound so powerful it seemed to come from the heavens themselves. The convoy rounded a bend in the road, revealing a picturesque olive grove that might have been plucked from a travel postcard, if not for the flash of sunlight on metal that caught Donovan's trained eye. "Ambush!" he shouted, swinging the massive barrel of the M2 toward the tree line, as the first rounds from the hidden German machine gun position stitched a deadly path toward the lead vehicle. The difference between life and death in that moment came down to simple physics. The superior range and penetrating power of Donovan's M2 against the German MG-42. As he squeezed the spade grips, the weapon came alive in his hands, its recoil transferring through his body into the floor of the half-track. The thunderous report of the 50 BMG rounds echoed across the valley, drowning out all other sounds of battle. The M2's 750-grain bullets tore through the olive trees with devastating effect, splintering wood, shredding foliage, and finding the hidden enemy position with terrifying accuracy. German soldiers who might have survived hits from smaller caliber weapons were thrown backward by the sheer kinetic energy of the 50 caliber rounds. Where their MG-42 struggled to penetrate the armor of the American vehicles at that range, Donovan's M2 simply punched through their hastily constructed stone breastwork as if it were cardboard. In 30 seconds of controlled fire, the ambush had been neutralized. The olive grove returned to silence save for the ringing in the ears of the American soldiers and the metallic ping of the M2's barrel cooling in the Mediterranean heat. This scene would play out countless times across the sun-baked battlefields of North Africa and Italy between 1942 and 1945. The M2 50 caliber machine gun, affectionately known as Deuce to the troops who depended on it, became more than just a weapon. It was a psychological anchor in the chaos of battle, a mechanical constant that could be relied upon when everything else seemed uncertain. Its distinctive silhouette atop vehicles and in defensive positions became an icon of American firepower, respected by allies and feared by enemies across the Mediterranean theater. The weapon's journey through this harsh landscape of extremes would write one of the most important yet often overlooked chapters in the history of modern warfare. The story of the M2 in the Mediterranean begins not with generals or politicians, but with a gunsmith from Ogden, Utah, John Moses Browning. In the closing days of World War I, Browning had been tasked with creating a weapon that could counter the growing threat of aircraft. Working with Winchester, he scaled up his already successful 30 caliber design to accommodate a massive new round, the 50 BMG cartridge, a bullet so powerful it would remain in service for over a century. Browning died in 1926, never seeing how his creation would dominate the battlefields of the next World War, particularly in the harsh conditions of North Africa and Italy, where its reliability and devastating power would make it indispensable. When the Americans arrived in North Africa in late 1942, they brought with them thousands of M2s mounted on vehicles carried by infantry and installed as aircraft armament. The weapon's baptism by fire in the Mediterranean came during Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa. Here in the dust and heat of the desert, the M2 revealed its first great virtue, reliability in extreme conditions. While other weapons jammed or failed under the constant assault of sand and dust, the robust design of the M2 continued to function with minimal maintenance. The desert, it seemed, had met its match in American engineering. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle of the 512th Heavy Tank Battalion recalled the first major engagement with German armor in Tunisia. The morning was still cool when we spotted Rommel's panzers moving across the valley floor, their outlines distorted by the rising heat waves. Our Shermans were outgunned by the German tanks, but we had a secret weapon, the M2s mounted on our turrets. As the panzers closed to what they thought was a safe distance for their superior main guns, our gunners opened up with the 50 cals. We weren't trying to penetrate their frontal armor. That would have been futile. Instead, we targeted their optics, their tracks, their external fuel tanks. The effect was immediate. German tank commanders buttoned up, their vision restricted. Their advance slowed, became hesitant. Some vehicles began smoking as incendiary rounds found vulnerable points. It wasn't a tank killer per se, but the M2 gave us the breathing room we needed, disrupting their attack long enough for our anti-tank units to move into position. The reputation of the M2 grew with each engagement. German prisoners spoke with a mixture of fear and respect about the American cannon that seemed to be everywhere. Italian troops, already struggling with outdated equipment and waning morale, particularly dreaded the sound of the 50 caliber. A captured document from the Italian 10th Army described it as the weapon that strikes from unexpected distances with the force of artillery but the precision of a rifle. This was no exaggeration. The M2's effective range of over a mile meant it occupied a unique tactical niche between conventional machine guns and light artillery, allowing American forces to establish fire superiority at distances their enemies couldn't match. As the North African campaign gave way to the invasion of Sicily, the weapon faced new challenges. The island's varied terrain, from coastal plains to rugged mountains, demanded versatility. Captain Anthony Morelli, company commander with the 1st Infantry Division, wrote in his journal, "The terrain here changes by the hour. Dusty roads give way to rocky hillsides, then suddenly you're in a lush valley or an ancient town with narrow streets. We've had to adapt quickly, and thank God for the 50. We mount it on vehicles for mobile operations, set it up on tripods when we dig in, even haul it up mountainsides when necessary. It's heavy as hell, but no one complains because we've all seen what it can do. Yesterday, we used one to clear a fortified church tower at 800 yards. One burst and the entire top of the bell tower collapsed, taking the German observation post with it. The men are calling it Italian urban renewal." The invasion of mainland Italy in September 1943 marked a new phase in the Mediterranean campaign, and with it came perhaps the M2's greatest test: the mountains. The Italian peninsula, with its spine of Apennine Mountains, presented a defensive nightmare for the advancing Allies. Narrow roads winding through steep valleys created perfect ambush conditions, and the Germans under Field Marshal Kesselring exploited this terrain masterfully. It was here that the M2's long-range and penetrating power proved most valuable, allowing American forces to engage enemy positions across valleys and through the light cover that dotted the hillsides. The winter of 1943-44 brought rain, mud, and misery to the Italian front. The advance slowed to a crawl as the Allies faced not only determined German resistance, but also some of the worst terrain and weather conditions of the European theater. Through it all, the M2 continued to perform when other weapons failed. Sergeant William Harris of the 34th Infantry Division described maintaining the weapon during this period. "You haven't known true devotion until you've seen a gunner cleaning his 50 cal at night by feel in freezing rain under a poncho. We treat these guns better than we treat ourselves because we know tomorrow they might be all that stands between us and eternity. The mud gets everywhere, freezes overnight, then thaws into a sticky mess by midday. Lesser weapons would have given up long ago, but the M2 keeps firing as long as you show it some basic respect. I've seen men share their last dry socks with their assistant gunner, just to ensure they'll be alert enough to keep the gun running during a firefight." The brutal battle for Monte Cassino from January to May 1944 illustrated the M2's versatility in perhaps the most challenging environment of the Italian campaign. The ancient abbey, perched atop a mountain with commanding views of the valley below, had been transformed into the linchpin of the German winter line. Direct assaults proved costly and ineffective. It was during this stalemate that American forces began using the M2 in an indirect fire role, essentially as light artillery. By elevating the weapon to its maximum angle and calculating rough trajectories, gunners could place plunging fire onto German positions on reverse slopes that were invisible from Allied lines. Master Sergeant Frank Cortez of the 36th Infantry Division pioneered this technique. We set up a battery of 4 M2s on a forward slope, shielded by a stone wall. Using maps and a bit of Kentucky windage, we worked out the elevations needed to drop fire into areas the Germans thought were safe. The rounds would come down almost vertically, penetrating makeshift bunkers and foxhole covers. After the first few barrages, we recovered German communication logs that described precision artillery strikes targeting their command posts. They had no idea it was machine gun fire. The psychological effect was tremendous. They couldn't understand how we were hitting positions that weren't visible from our lines. By early 1944, the Allies had established air superiority over the Mediterranean theater, and here too the M2 played a crucial role. Mounted in batteries of 6 to 8 guns on American fighters like the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt, the weapon transformed these aircraft into flying artillery platforms capable of devastating ground targets. Pilots referred to their guns as Hitler's buzzsaws, capable of shredding vehicles, structures, and unfortunately human beings with terrifying efficiency. The German Wehrmacht learned to fear the distinctive sound of American fighter bombers, knowing what their .50 caliber armament could do to expose troops or vehicles. Captain James Reynolds flew ground attack missions with the 27th Fighter Squadron over Italy. When we came in low with all 8 50s firing, it was like dragging a blowtorch across the landscape. Everything in that path just disappeared. Vehicles, gun positions, supply dumps. We could cut through the walls of stone buildings as if they were paper. After a pass, all that would be left was smoke, debris, and a few dazed survivors. The brass called it interdiction, cutting enemy supply lines and reinforcements. We called it plowing the field. The M2 made that possible. Nothing else had the combination of rate of fire, penetration, and reliability needed for the job. It wasn't just in the air that the M2 dominated. Naval operations throughout the Mediterranean relied heavily on the weapon for defense against aircraft and small boats. Every American PT boat, landing craft, and support vessel bristled with M2s, creating a protective web of fire that German and Italian forces struggled to penetrate. During the Anzio landings in January 1944, this naval firepower proved decisive in repelling Luftwaffe attacks on the vulnerable beachhead. Lieutenant Commander Michael Hawkins of the U.S. Navy recalled, "We had a ring of LSTs, landing ship tank, forming the outer perimeter of the Anzio anchorage, each with multiple M2 positions. When German aircraft came in at dusk, we put up a wall of tracers that looked like something from a science fiction novel, solid streams of light reaching into the sky. You could see German pilots visibly flinch and break off their attack runs when they hit that curtain of fire. Those that pressed through rarely made it back out. One Junkers pilot who survived being shot down told our intelligence officers that flying through American .50 caliber fire was like trying to run through a steel factory with molten metal splashing everywhere. That's the kind of deterrent we needed when every ship in that harbor was packed with men, vehicles, and ammunition." As the Italian campaign ground on through 1944 and into 1945, the M2's legend only grew. Veterans rotated home carrying stories of its effectiveness, while fresh troops arrived having already heard the legends. The weapon became a symbol of American industrial might, a tangible example of how standardization and mass production could deliver overwhelming firepower to every corner of the battlefield. By war's end, more than 5 million M2s had been produced, and they had fired billions of rounds across the Mediterranean theater alone. But statistics cannot capture the human relationship between soldiers and this remarkable weapon. For the men who served in the dust of North Africa and the mountains of Italy, the M2 was more than equipment. It was a steadfast companion in the worst moments of their lives. Staff Sergeant Robert Michaels of the 88th Infantry Division expressed this bond in a letter home. "There are 6 men in my squad, but it's the 7th member that keeps us alive, our M2. We've named her Rosie, after the riveter in those posters, because like those women in the factories back home, she never quits and never complains, just keeps delivering the goods. When we rotate off the line, at least 2 men stay with Rosie at all times. We take turns sleeping under her, keeping the rain off with a shelter half. The replacement officers think we're crazy until their first firefight. After that, they understand. In this place, with mountains in every direction, and Germans looking down on us from every ridge, that gun is the difference between going home vertical or horizontal." The weapon's effectiveness stemmed from several technical factors that proved particularly valuable in Mediterranean conditions. Its 50 BMG round generated tremendous kinetic energy, allowing it to penetrate light armor, stone walls, and multiple layers of sandbags, all common features of the Italian battlefield. Its effective range, extending beyond 2,000 yards for area targets, meant that it could engage enemy positions across the valleys and ravines that characterized much of the terrain. Perhaps most importantly, the M2's reliability in extreme conditions, from desert heat to mountain snow, meant that it would function when needed most, without the failures that plagued more delicate weapons. This reliability didn't come without cost. The M2 was exceptionally heavy, weighing over 80 pounds with its tripod, making it a burden to transport, especially in mountainous terrain. Teams of men struggled to drag the weapon up steep slopes, sometimes taking hours to move it just a few hundred yards. The gun consumed ammunition at a prodigious rate, creating constant logistical challenges. Despite these drawbacks, no American commander would willingly go into battle without his complement of M2s. The weapon had proven itself too valuable, too decisive to leave behind. In the spring of 1945, as Allied forces pushed north through the Po Valley toward the Alps, the war in Italy was reaching its conclusion. The German forces were in retreat, but still dangerous, fighting desperate rearguard actions and setting ambushes at every opportunity. It was during one of these final actions that the M2 would demonstrate its value one last time in the Mediterranean theater. April 22, 1945. A small American reconnaissance force from the 10th Mountain Division was advancing cautiously through the outskirts of Parma when they encountered a German blocking position centered around a stone farmhouse. The Americans were outnumbered and outgunned, with the German force possessing several MG-42 machine guns and at least one 20mm anti-aircraft cannon repurposed for ground fire. Pinned down in drainage ditches alongside the road, the American situation seemed hopeless until Private First Class Anthony DeLuca managed to drag his M2, disassembled in its transport configuration, through an irrigation canal to a flanking position. Working methodically despite incoming fire, DeLuca and his assistant gunner reassembled the weapon, its parts slick with canal water and mud. Their hands shook not from fear but from exhaustion. They had been in continuous combat for 6 days with minimal rest. As they locked the barrel into place and fed the ammunition belt, German bullets kicked up mud just inches from their position. With the gun finally assembled, DeLuca took careful aim at the farmhouse. His first burst struck the stonework around a window where a German MG-42 had been firing. The 50 caliber rounds blasted chunks of ancient masonry into deadly fragments, silencing the enemy gun. Adjusting his aim, DeLuca methodically engaged each German position, the M2's devastating firepower transforming the balance of the skirmish in a matter of minutes. The 20mm cannon, which could have devastated the American force, was abandoned by its crew after DeLuca's fire killed the gunner and wounded the loader. Within 15 minutes, white flags appeared at the farmhouse windows. Afterward, the German commander, a veteran Feldwebel who had fought from Africa to Sicily to mainland Italy, asked to see the weapon that had broken his defense. Standing before the mud-covered M2, he simply nodded and said in accented English, "We call this the weapon that speaks only once, because if it speaks to you, you do not live to hear it again." It was perhaps the most fitting epitaph for the M2's service in the Mediterranean campaign, respected even by those who had faced its wrath across 3 years and thousands of miles of bitter fighting. As the war in Italy drew to its conclusion in the spring of 1945, the legacy of the M250 caliber machine gun was already secure. From the searing heat of the North African desert to the snow-capped peaks of the Apennines, it had proven itself the most versatile and devastating infantry support weapon in the American arsenal. Its distinctive silhouette and unmistakable sound had become emblematic of American military power, a symbol of industrial might harnessed for war. For the men who served alongside it, the M2 represented something more personal, a reliable guardian in the most unreliable of circumstances. In a war where so much seemed chaotic and beyond control, the steady performance of this remarkable weapon provided a rare constant. They had asked it to function in dust storms and blizzards, to fire accurately after being dragged through mud and snow, to keep running when everything else failed. Time and again it had answered the call. Today, as visitors walk the war cemeteries and battlefields of North Africa and Italy, the physical scars of that conflict have largely faded. The desert has reclaimed the tank tracks, the mountains have shrugged off the shell holes, and the cities have rebuilt their broken walls. Yet the stories remain, passed down through generations, preserved in letters, diaries, and official histories. And in those stories, the thunder of the M250 caliber machine gun echoes still, testament to American engineering and to the men who carried this remarkable weapon into battle across the forgotten sands of war. As you stand on those distant shores where young men once fought and died, listen closely to the wind. In its whisper, you might just hear the ghostly report of Deuce, still standing guard over memories that must never be forgotten, still speaking for those who can speak no more. Their story is our heritage, their sacrifice our foundation. In remembering their struggle with the tools they carried, from the humble entrenching tool to the mighty M2, We honor not just the weapon, but the hands that wielded it in defense of freedom on those Mediterranean battlefields so long ago.